I'm the typical last bencher who is just keenly watching everything. I'm not starstruck.
Right.
I'm not easily starstruck. If at all I'm starstruck, it has to be by Sri S.L. Bhairappa. These are the kind of people who I'm really in awe of, not film stars. So I'm capable of watching any movie as long as the message is delivered with conviction.
Right.
Andaz Apna Apna is something I still laugh over.
Correct.
Okay, that's a great movie according to me.
Right.
And I'm equally capable of watching Atank Hi Atank only for the buffoonery there. Okay?
Right.
I can watch a Godfather,
Right.
and I can watch a Basha by Rajnikant, I can watch a Hum by Amitabh, I can watch Anatomy of a Murder with Jimmy Stewart in it, I can watch a Rajamouli, I can watch a Quentin Tarantino. I can even watch the movies of the 80s with Jitendra and Sridevi in it. Okay, just for the sake of understanding what clicked then, what they thought would click then.
Hello everyone, welcome to News 18 Showsha. We have with us Mr. J Sai Deepak. He is an engineer turned lawyer and now a best-selling author. His current work, India, Bharat, Pakistan, The Constitutional Journey of a Sandwiched Civilization, is the follow-up to India, that is Bharat. Both of them, the first one of course was a bestseller. This is of course on course to being a bestseller. Thank you for joining us, sir. Welcome.
Thank you.
First of all, how has the reception been for the book? I see you traveling from cities to cities, and you're also staying right next to the runway. So how has that been?
So I think the first book has managed to create a captive audience and a fair bit of interest. And the interest in the first book itself was generated thanks to the talks and the lectures that I delivered between 2016 and 2021. Okay. And therefore the audience was fairly curious as to what is it that I had to say in the first book, which I had not already said outside. So from what I understand, the first book has sold about 75 to 80,000 copies, excluding the counterfeits. That's about 50% of it. And around 10,000 Kindle versions. So even if you take 50% of that number as the conservative captive audience, there is a good number of, let's say, 45 to 50,000 people waiting for the sequels. Usually, when a book is first printed, in the first print run, you are looking at between 5,000 to 10,000 copies if it is in the non-fiction category, right? And especially if it happens to be a subject which is fairly serious and sober. So they had printed 25,000 copies in the first run. Now I'm told that it's about to be exhausted in the next 3 or 4 days.
Wonderful.
And the pre-order link was launched on the 16th of May. And it's been consistently number 1 and number 2 in the political categories, and consistently in the top 100 in the overall list of books in Amazon. And the only reason it sometimes struggles at number 2, the second book, is because number 1 remains India, that is Bharat. Right. And that's one of the reasons that there's a constant tug of war between these two. In fact, until 2 weeks ago, 1, 2, and 3 were India, that is Bharat, India, Bharat and Pakistan, and India, Bharat and Pakistan Kindle version. That's how the numbers were. And the reception across the country has been good. I have been fairly select in the kind of cities that I wanted to go to, which have the ability to create a multiplier effect and which have a known readership. So Bangalore is where I started my outstation book tour after the launch in Delhi, followed by Pune and then Mumbai. And I can safely say, although I don't consider myself an author because then you'll have to earn your livelihood from writing, which is not the case here, that these 3 cities are an author's dream. Because the kind of reception you get, the kind of sharp questions that come your way, the kind of preparedness with which the audience approaches these subjects, it's fantastic. So there's a lot of hope. And it's not just the over 50 generation that you're looking at. Between 18 to 35, there's a fantastic demographic there.
Right. If I sort of take you back to when you sort of started appearing in the public sphere, be it during the Sabrimala protests, started appearing on news debates, and then of course the books that have become bestsellers now.
Right.
Are these definitive movements that you sort of think that changed your life? Is it something that you thought would happen? How did you sort of prepare for, say, the live debates where 10 people are speaking and you have to put your point across? How do you get around those places?
So, without sounding cliched, I've always been fairly comfortable with public speaking and debating. Right. And that's been my track record since my schooling days. It just so happens that my choice of engineering was inconsistent with that particular track record. Right. And it's not as if I was pushed into engineering. I certainly took up to that particular subject with a lot of interest. By the time I was done with engineering, this much was clear, that I wanted to be in a particular profession that allowed me to articulate my position with a fair degree of confidence and training. Because anybody can have an opinion, as I've said before.
Yeah.
It's important to have some kind of qualification under your belt, which informs the opinion that comes from you. And therefore, the transition to law, at least in my headspace, was fairly logical considering what I wanted to do. Now, I was, remain, and shall always be a lawyer, and that's my primary profession. I see the book writing activities as an extension of my professional commitments, simply because I still remain within the bounds of law, where I speak on the Constitution. The only difference is, while most people look at the subject of Constitution primarily from a legal perspective, I am saying that there is a civilizational aspect to it, there is a cultural aspect to it, there is a historical aspect to it, there is a politico-scientific aspect to it. All of these will have to be read together for you to arrive at a particular constitution. So therefore, the books are, I would say, a culmination or a convergence of history, political science, and law.
To write about these things, you'll still sort of require a training to kind of have a prose that flows.
Right.
So that can be a page turner as well.
Right.
Has this been a learning experience, or have you sort of, having been a lawyer already, had a bit of understanding of how to write and how to ensure that it's sort of cadence and the prose certainly flows?
See, one of the things that the Sabarimala experience effectively taught me, which, to answer your previous question, was certainly a definitive movement, is that it's very, very important to be able to convey your thoughts, both in writing as well as in speaking. I believe that I have the skill sets to, let's say, deliver on both fronts. And the second book is much better in its writing style compared to the first. Because in the first, the rigid drafting of a lawyer comes through. And therefore, I have been told that the reading is fairly dense and archaic in the structure. It was partly intended and partly, how do I put it, there was no other way, because that's the only way I know how to write after having been litigated for 13 years now, right? Long sentences, multiple punctuations, abuse of semicolons, right? So that's something that, by way of feedback from the readers, I have incorporated in the second book. Although it's a longer book, this is an easier read in terms of the sentence flow and structure. But the subject and its, let's say, examination remain as rigorous. And I have been told as much. That, and now people are realizing that an argument that was presented in a slightly theoretical fashion in the first book and with a fair degree of conceptual explanation now finds direct application in the second book. So they're able to piece everything together, and then they say, oh, now we understand your position better.
Right. So, coming to the book, the research is exhaustive. I mean, you reproduce texts and author articles that have been written some 60, 80 years ago.
Right.
How has that research been? How did you go around trying to figure out where to put what, and how did you how do I say it, ensure that this follows after this chapter, this follows after this chapter?
So let me break the response to your questions into two parts. The first is the question of the material, and then is the structurization of the particular material. Let's say an intellectual property lawyer in my primary avatar as a lawyer. So credit has to be given where it's due. At least about 45 to 50% of the research, the credit for it must go to my research team. So I have a separate set of juniors for my commercial litigation, and I have a separate set of juniors for constitutional law, history, and public international law. So there are two specific researchers, Shaktiki Sharma and Vanya Agarwal, who have been working with me for quite a few years now. And Shaktiki Sharma in particular has been working with me since my Sabarimala days, at least from the reference petition onwards. So this team effectively understands the vision I had for the book, the trilogy in fact, and now which is of course a quadrilogy, a tetralogy. And therefore, they understand how my brain works and in what direction is a particular argument moving. So about 40% or 45% of the research comes from my own reading of first-hand political and historical literature. And since they are trained lawyers, I would basically tell them that please look for these debates for this particular Kalakhand, this particular time frame. And they'd pull it out, they'd summarize it for me, or even underline portions which they think is relevant, and then I'll go through it. So that's how it was worked out. In terms of structure, when you practice as an arguing counsel before the court, one of the most important skill sets that you're expected to possess is to structure your argument.
Right.
Okay? So assume for a moment you come to me and you say, sir, I have this particular case that needs to be presented. And you give me the entire Ramayanam. Assuming for a moment you give me about 25 bullets to fire in court. I'm not ever going to have the time in court to present all the 25 bullets because the court has limited time, right? Multiple matters. So it falls upon the arguing counsel to decide what is the best possible way in which the case can be presented, and therefore a prioritization of arguments goes through.
Right.
That helps you structure. So usually what happens is once you're done presenting your argument, then the court expects you to file what is known as a written submission, which is a summary of your arguments, your oral submissions. There you have to structure the argument.
Right.
There you get to build all the 25 bullets, but again you have to prioritize it.
Correct.
That training has come handy
Right.
in the structuring of the book.
So coming to the content of the book, the first prerequisite sort of is to let go of your heroes in the national movement,
Correct.
independence movement, and to approach them rationally. I'm sure growing up you've had your own heroes.
Correct.
And how did you approach them rationally? How to sort of ensure that you write about them in a honest manner and not be emotionally involved with them, and to say that this should not have been done and this perhaps should have been done. How did you approach that?
I think most people go through a certain transition in their lives, regardless of who they are as people, which is the clear blacks and whites in your life gradually move towards the grey as you grow old.
Right.
That maturity happens in general.
Right.
And that automatically changes your perception at every level towards every subject. History not being an exception to this rule.
Right.
Okay. So the sense of idealism that perhaps I may have had maybe even 10 or 15 years ago is not the sense of idealism with which I look at history anymore. Okay. So I'm simply saying people are mixed bags, and therefore history has to be a mixed bag.
Right.
Because it's an agglomeration of individual histories. Right. And therefore, at the outset, I had no preconceived notions by the time I started writing the second book.
Right.
And this much was clear, that I told myself that let the information shape the opinion. Of course, there are a certain set of biases which are ideological in nature. I subscribe to a very specific school of thought, which I will hopefully never give up. And therefore, you're looking for facts which feed on to that particular preconceived notion. Then the rational mind has to push back and say, don't fall, don't succumb to confirmation bias.
Right.
Wherein you're simply looking for facts that feed your information. So when contrary information presents itself, you have to deal with it. That has been a very serious learning experience. And two, even the tallest of our heroes, how they may have let down the civilization at crucial junctures when the chips were down, is a lesson which I think needs to be taught to the current generation. Let's not use the word taught because perhaps it's condescending, which needs to be shared.
Right.
And therefore, I am trying to share my own learnings here. This book is as much, let's say, an exercise in self-indulgence and self-learning, as much as it is an exercise in sharing what I've learned. And therefore, since I am trying to be honest in my own learning curve, that honesty is hopefully percolating even with the reader. Right. And the conversation is with the reader. That's been the attempt so far. And now I'm almost open to any possibility about any leader.
Right. You bust a lot of myths in this book. The major one that we've been sort of taught was that, and we continue to hear, is about Mr. Jinnah.
Right.
Him being a secular lawyer who was sadly forced into the faction that wanted Pakistan.
Right.
Otherwise, India wouldn't have been partitioned. But you sort of mention and you write about how he held dual membership, of course, that everyone did about with Congress and Muslim League.
Right.
But there was a bias towards the Muslim League, and that comes across very, very naturally.
Correct.
And so, how do you see that? How do you see that? Why is that there?
See, the point is, I think very few people have the patience to look into the primary sources.
Right.
And therefore, I've gone to the proceedings of the Muslim League and the proceedings of the Congress themselves, their own resolutions, to see what is it that they have said.
Right.
And where are we getting this received wisdom from? So perhaps I'll give you an example from my own profession. There are judgments and there are books that summarize the judgment.
Right.
I rarely read a law book because that is the interpretation of the author of a particular judgment. And therefore I prefer to read the judgment directly. Only when I believe that a particular question hasn't been answered, and therefore for ease of reference I look at a law book, because the appendix gives you a ready reference to something. But other than that, my own approach has been look for primary references as much as possible. I've brought that particular experience to bear in my reading of history. Not to say that there are no secondary propositions here. But what I've done is that I've relied on extensive PhD theses, which I've extracted in the book. Because as part of a PhD thesis, you undergo a much more rigorous process than simply even the publication of a mainstream book, by the way. because you're going to be subjected to a lot of internal and external validation.
Correct.
So I've relied on that, and I've looked for their footnotes to see what are they saying. So that kind of corroboration I've tried to do, because you see the subject is already sensitive, and I don't want to be accused of either plagiarism, or for that matter of distorting history or paraphrasing it in a distorted fashion. Therefore, the strategy of the first book in terms of extracting primary sources continues here, which has now given readers a greater handle, because in the first book they said इतना सब कुछ extract करने की क्या ज़रूरत थी, आप इसी बात को एक पैरा में शॉर्ट कर देते हैं. I said, assuming that my political or ideological biases are out in the public domain already, people are bound to say this paraphrasing is a reflection of his bias and not the reflection of the truth. I've taken away that argument from the other side by presenting the primary source. And when I deal with an even more sensitive subject, when I'm looking at the confluence of religion and politics, that strategy is even more relevant. And therefore, I think it's worked really, really well. So I'm 100% sure that history departments across the board will now have to reevaluate the way they've presented Bharatiya history to students.
Should I ask this, whether should Indians concede that Mr. Jinnah won? Should we concede that?
I have said so as much, at least in 2 book discussions as part of this book launch. I've said this, that given his, let's say, intention, he partially won. So assume for a moment, you have a home. Your victory cannot be that I've lost only 1/3 of it. The fact that you've lost 1/3 is your defeat. And the fact that he moved from 0 to 1/3 is his victory. His aspiration may have been 100%, but that he landed with 33% still goes to his benefit. That's how I would see either Kashmir or Bharat for that matter. Whether it's POK or Akhand Bharat, that's my assessment.
There's a lot of discussion even today about the Khilafat movement. The need for it, should we have even indulged in it? How do you of course it's a pivotal moment in Indian history. You mentioned about how Swami Shraddhanand supported it, the Shankaracharya of Sharda Peeth supported it, Anne Besant supported it, Lokmanya Tilak supported it. I was not aware of it, but it's on the Wikipedia page, the Mopilla riots that happened. It's quite graphic and descriptive in its nature, the letter that she wrote to Mr. Gandhi. Even this has sort of been erased, and now there was a film that was supposed to come up that has been shelved. Do you see these things happening because of your efforts and what's happening on social media and others trying to inform others about what is happening?
I won't even take remotely any credit for this, because for someone to actually hope to make a movie on the Mopla genocide or the genocide by the Moplas, and that too in Kerala under the current circumstances, the credit goes entirely to that gutsy person, whoever did this. Okay? So I don't wish to take credit for it. But the one thing that I felt that this particular episode need to be captured in greater detail, in fact, multiple reasons. One, in September 2021, last year, as part of my book tour, and especially as part of Dr. Shashi Tharoor's book launch, there was a debate in Chennai where this issue came about. And he presented it as a peasant rebellion, and perhaps a rebellion against the colonial establishment, when in fact that was not the entirety of the picture, nor even the true picture. And I said as much there. And since the theme of this particular book gave me an opportunity to address this in some detail, I chose to go, let's say, full steam, all guns blazing, with all the primary literature being quoted there. That's one. Two, I also believe that the time has come where the society is ready for uncomfortable facts. No wonder the clamor for changing the history syllabus of this country is growing with each passing day. So there is already a fertile ground and a receptive audience which is waiting to consume this information. It's only for people to latch onto this particular opportunity and make the most of this particular window that history has presented and push as many facts as possible, so that historical inaccuracies can be set right. These legacy issues can be addressed.
So you talk about decoloniality, and where do you sort of, if I may say so, place your works with respect to what Sri Aurobindo has written, Swami Vivekananda has written. Let's say what even Mr. Gandhi has written, Pandit Nehru's Discovery of India. Where do you place these works? Do you see your books as building up on them, or do you see your works sort of as a revival of what they wrote?
My book is in principle a negation of everything that Mr. Nehru stood for. Okay, there I will not beat around the bush. There may be certain partial overlaps with Mr. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, but there ends the issue. and any of those overlaps are at best coincidences, nothing which is intended. But I certainly believe that my work is a reflection of the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and Swami Vivekananda. So in the first book, I could have directly begun with their works as the basis for Bharatiya decolonial exercise. But you see, when the Indian mind is buried under the influence of the West, it therefore requires a compare and contrast exercise for it to be able to consume something that is Indian. You will consume yoga because it's become cool in the West. Right? Until then, I've heard people, even the educated elites of this country, call it uncle yoga. Apparently, it's meant only for the middle-aged. Okay? When in fact, the world's best athletes are now resorting to yoga. Right? So, the point was to draw a particular literature from that sphere of influence where the mind is currently engaged in and say, okay, this is what the literature says. Now, let me present to you something that is native. Now tell me, why are you accepting this and glorifying this and rejecting this?
Right.
And therefore, that compare and contrast exercise was effectively the red pilling that I was performing. Once that compare and contrast exercise hit home in terms of exposing the internal hypocrisy of the Indian mind or the Bharatiya mind, then the mind is ready for further information, and then I'll push it further.
Right.
And hence, my calculated decision to start with Western literature, gradually move towards Bharatiya literature, and then connect the two and say, why on earth would you accept the decolonial literature that comes from Latin Americas, where they clearly speak of the evangelizing and colonializing tendency of that entire Western, let's say European experience. And when we do so, we are being told focus on the economic disparities that they created as opposed to the religious destruction that they perpetrated with a very conscious motive. And why do you not wish to talk about what happened even before that?
Right.
These are certain uncomfortable questions that I raised in the first book. So in chapter 6 of the first book, I specifically made a reference to Middle Eastern coloniality in the hope that I would build on it later. Although I did not have a clear picture as to how I would. I went through a creative epiphany in January of this year, which changed the entire scope of the second book. And that's how the second book resulted in the current shape.
Right. I've always wondered what you made of Mr. V.S. Naipaul's works, because in early 2000s and late 1990s, he was the one who sort of everyone thought showed the mirror to the Indians about what civilization was and how it was destroyed and everything. He was, of course, admired by many for his prose. Do you see, did he have a Western lens? Because, of course, he was educated in Oxford and whatnot.
I think Sri Naipaul presents a very curious picture. I'll tell you why. Because his heart was certainly bleeding for the Hindu civilization. That much is clear. That he saw that it was a wounded civilization is not a wrong assessment. Okay? And his visits were predominantly in the pre-liberalization era. And therefore, what you were looking at is the Nehruvian Marxist setup of growth rate and everything else, which he ended up assuming is a reflection of the native society's inability to catch up with the West, when in fact it was an artificial fetter. Right? And then his works start taking a slightly different tone post-liberalization, wherein he realizes, oh, perhaps my assessment may have been incorrect. Okay? But to the extent he openly talks of the destruction, let's say, caused by Islamic invaders as far as Bharat is concerned, to that extent you must give him credit. Because for his period, and in that particular generation, for someone to say this, because you see, if he was moving in these Western circles and fashionable circles, he could have comfortably mouthed the very same leftist narrative about Bharatiya history. He chose to come out differently. His reactions to what happened in 1992 were very, very clear in terms of where his allegiances lay. That cannot be denied. So therefore, I would say that his was a case of a gradual evolution where he was open to recalibrating his own position. So I am not going to be particularly uncharitable or too stringent in my analysis of Mr. Naipaul. I'd still say his heart was in the right place.
Coming to sort of a lighter note, not necessarily a lighter note, you're a film buff as well, and you've spoken extensively on why Kashmir Files was an important film for India. You've understood the need for cinema in Indic Renaissance. How do you see the future with respect to cinema?
It's going to be a glorious tussle between a bunch of wokes and a bunch of Bharatiyas. And I'd want to watch what this produces in terms of both artistic expression and the social service function that movies or art performs. Be it RRR, Kashmir Files, or Bahubali for that matter, Tanaji, they're all signaling something very different. I just hope it's not merely someone cashing in on the blowing wind and looking at an economic opportunity at civilizational expense, and I hope there is some real interest there. So I'm keenly looking forward to it, and I may even disclose this, that some directors from the South and superstars of the South have shown interest in the content of the first and second books.
Right.
So let's see what happens.
So do you see them using this as a handbook to write their scripts? And
I would say so, because I've been consulted at least on one critical issue with respect to an upcoming movie of a Southern superstar.
Oh, great.
Yes.
You caught me off guard there. Is that something that excites you, working with a film crew, working with directors, contributing your ideas to a script?
No, it's not a question, because I don't suffer from any kind of, what do they call it? I'm not starstruck.
Right.
I'm not easily starstruck. If at all I'm starstruck, it has to be by Sri S.L. Bhairappa. These are the kind of people who I'm really in awe of, not film stars.
Right.
Nothing disrespectful,
Of course.
but I know where my priorities lie and what is it that truly excites me. But in terms of being given an opportunity to create a multiplier effect through the big screen, 100% that excites me, simply because then the impact is visceral, direct, and in perhaps the most, let's say, watched medium, so to speak at this point, where you can confidently say that that when people leave the theatre, the analysis is not going to be as nuanced as a book. You'll immediately know whether it's this way or that way. It's almost like a blood spot, right? And therefore, that's the test of both the idea as well as your ability to break that idea down for public consumption.
Correct.
In a book, I get to flesh out everything with commas, footnotes and everything.
Right.
In a movie, you don't get that.
Right.
So my own sense of clarity with respect to the idea will be tested if at all it were ever to be taken up for an exposition through the big screen.
Right.
So that would be a different kind of learning curve. So learning interests me, so that's the way I look at it.
So you're a film buff. What kind of films do you like watching?
So I am capable of watching any movie as long as the message is delivered with conviction.
Right.
Andaz Apna Apna is something I still laugh over.
Correct.
Okay, that's a great movie according to me.
Right.
And I'm equally capable of watching Atank Hi Atank only for the buffoonery there. Okay,
Right.
I can watch a Godfather,
Right.
and I can watch a Basha by Rajnikant. I can watch a Hum by Amitabh. I can watch Anatomy of a Murder with Jimmy Stewart in it. I can watch a Rajamouli. I can watch a Quentin Tarantino. I can even watch the movies of the 80s with Jitendra and Sridevi in it. Okay, just for the sake of understanding what clicked then, what they thought would click then.
Correct.
Because for me, this is a fantastic, let's say, exercise in understanding human psychology.
Right.
More than anything else, that's what I'm interested in. I'm the typical last bencher who is just keenly watching everything.
Right.
That's what that was my position in law school, which is sit on the last bench, observe everything, and then if possible make fun of everything.
Thank you for joining us, sir. That will be the end of our questions. You've been very gracious with your answers.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.